If you're listening to this while falling asleep, welcome. If you've been here before, it's good to have you back. And if this is your first time, take a deep breath, silence your phone, maybe put in a pair of earphones, and let your shoulders fall. So feel free to drift in and out. You're not meant to remember it all. You're just meant to rest. And as always, before we begin, feel free to let us know. What time are you watching this? Where in the world are you falling asleep from tonight? We love reading your sleepy check-ins. Now, let's gently begin. Before the world was quiet, before soft pillows and memory foam and locked doors and bedtime books, there were candlelit chambers, rush-strewn floors, and shadowed walls. And behind them, in whispers, rituals, silences, people lived. People long before us. People with desire, with guilt, with secrets. This segment explores the quiet intimacy of daily medieval life. How people approached love, lust, shame, privacy, and the body. We begin not in palaces or scandals, but in thatched cottages, stone hearths, and wooden begs shared by peasants, craftsmen, and mothers of five. It was a narrow room, not much larger than a modern closet. The walls, made of wattle and daub, were thin. The cold slipped in through the seams, but at the far side stood a bed, low to the ground, stuffed with straw, and covered with a coarse woolen blanket. Here, most married couples slept together, along with a child or two, a servant perhaps, and sometimes even livestock on colder nights. Privacy, as we know it, did not exist. But even without solitude, sex persisted, quietly, modestly, and often without ceremony. A husband might come home from the fields, his hands still dirty, his hair smelling of hay. A wife might be half asleep, the baby already at her breast. There were no candles, no locked doors. Only the creak of the floor and the low thud of movement beneath blankets. It was not passion, it was routine, it was life. And for many, it was followed by conception. Children came regularly, often yearly, and with them the cycle of work and worry began again. In medieval thought, the body was not truly separate from the soul. Desire, if left unchecked, could stain both. And so, the church entered the bedchamber, not physically, but spiritually, through doctrine, through guilt, through whispered confession. Sex, the clergy taught, was not sinful in itself, but it had to serve a purpose. Procreation. It was to be modest, regular, and restrained. Pleasure was tolerated, but never praised. Acts seen as unnatural, anything other than the so-called natural union, were described in manuals and sermons with chilling precision. Kissing on feast days, embracing during Lent, attempting conception during menstruation. All were sins to be confessed and cleansed. And so people confessed to elderly priests in cold stone churches, to traveling friars, to scribes who recorded their penance in cautious Latin, never using names. A woman might confess to wanting too much, a man to using herbs to delay conception, a couple to desiring each other in the wrong position or at the wrong hour. And in return, penance, prayer, fasting, quiet shame. There was no guidebook for marital desire, only rules and consequences. The body belonged not to the self, but to the church, to the soul, and to the slow ticking of salvation. In the medieval world, sex was never simple. It was bound not only in guilt, but in risk, because after the embrace came something far more unpredictable: pregnancy. And with it came a silence. A woman who had missed her flow was not congratulated, she was observed. She watched for signs: sore limbs, shifting appetite, sudden melancholy. There were no tests, only instinct and time. By the second month, she might begin to wear a looser gown. By the third, she would carry amulets, one to protect her womb, another a ribbon dyed in saffron to keep the spirits. And by the fifth month, her husband might sleep more quietly, knowing she was stepping into a mystery that neither of them could control. Midwives were often the only guides. They kept bundles of dried herbs: tansy, rue, pennyroyal, mugwort. Some were brewed into teas to encourage menstruation. Others, when conception had taken hold, were used to calm the womb, to quiet the restless child within. In the final weeks, the house was prepared. The bed was layered with linen. A cross was hung on the wall. Holy water was kept nearby, and a basin in case the baby came in blood. No one spoke of pain, only of hope. But even here, in the most natural of events, death was close. Many women did not survive childbirth. They bled, they seized, they whispered prayers that faded before the final cry. Others survived, but with silence stitched into their bone. They returned to the world changed, aged, even if young. The intimacy that began in dim light had led to this. A wife, a wound, and, if she was lucky, a child who would live through winter. Children were blessings, but too many could ruin a household. Too many mouths meant thinned porridge, divided inheritance, and bodies too tired to carry firewood through snow. And so, though the church forbade it, many sought ways to space, delay, or avoid conception altogether. There were no clinics, only lore, and it passed from mother to daughter, not through books, but through touch and timing. Some women watched the moon. They tracked the cycles of their bleeding, counting days with knotted thread. A woman might avoid her husband on fertile days, not always successfully. Others believed in the cooling period, that conception could be avoided if a woman washed immediately after the act, using cold water or wine infused with bitter herbs. But the method was not precise, and the price of error could not be undone. The most commonly used plants were not for health, but for prevention. Pennyroyal, crushed into wine. Rue, chewed fresh before sleep. Queen Anne's lace, the seeds taken after a missed cycle. Tansy, steeped in boiling water until the steam itself was bitter. These herbs were known to midwives, and to healers, and to women who had lost too many infants, to hunger or cold. But they were dangerous. Taken too early, they did nothing. Taken too late, they could end a life. Not just of the child, but of the mother. Family planning was never named. There was no term for it in Latin. It existed in whispers. Wives asked older women. Mistresses relied on maids. Nuns who left the convent carried knowledge rarely spoken in church. Even prostitutes, especially them, shared tricks of heat and timing. And when children did come, they were loved. But when they didn't, no one asked. Because silence protected more than secrecy. It protected the rhythm of survival. Even in a world defined by faith and fear, desire still wandered. It crept into quiet spaces, between betrothals arranged too young, between marriages forged for land and loyalty, between the cracks of daily repetition. And it was there, in those spaces, that affairs began. A husband, returned from war, might find his wife older, colder. A wife, weary from children and duty, might grow fond of a servant, a merchant, a priest. The church condemned adultery as a mortal sin, but the world was not so simple. In cities like Paris and Venice, love letters were exchanged behind shutters. In villages, discreet glances became lingering touches while drawing water. In castles, courtiers whispered beneath tapestries, their trysts hidden among servants too afraid to speak. Sometimes it was love, sometimes only escape. For women, the risks were devastating. Caught in adultery, a noble woman might be sent to a convent, or divorced, shamed, impoverished, her children taken. A peasant woman might be beaten, branded, or worse, forced to carry her sin in the form of a child. Some wore amulets of protection, not for the body, but for the secret. Others disappeared quietly, sent away during pregnancies to visit cousins, only to return hollow-eyed and silent, the child gone, the story buried. Even those sworn to chastity faltered. Clergymen kept mistresses in separate towns, or nieces who lived too close. Kings like Charles II of Navarre and Philip IV of France had lovers enshrined in court, and queens, some, found passion in silence. The most careful left no letters, no jewelry exchanged, only a child with the wrong eyes, or a poem so beautiful it could not be written by the husband. Desire could not be erased, only hidden. And even then, it lived on in stone, in carved faces on cathedral columns, in songs passed through villages, in stories too scandalous to be true, but never entirely false. She stood by the doorframe, not veiled, not hidden, but never truly seen. The medieval prostitute was part of nearly every city, from London to Lubeck, Florence to Ghent. She lived not in brothels alone, but in narrow alleys, above taverns, or in the shadows of the cathedral itself. In some cities, prostitution was tolerated, even regulated. Women registered with the city. They paid taxes. They worked under rules: where to stand, what to wear, when to leave the streets. In Avignon, the papal court tolerated brothels near its walls. In Nuremberg, women belonged to a kind of unofficial guild, allowed to work, but not allowed to marry. Their clothing was marked: a yellow scarf, a blue sleeve, a strip of cloth that said, "This woman does not belong to you." Most did not choose this path. They had been abandoned by husbands, or orphaned, or found themselves pregnant with no place to go. Some were war widows. Others escaped worse fates: starvation, beggary, servitude. To sell the body was to survive. The work was not glamorous. It was cold, often brutal, and the risk of disease, especially the French pox, loomed large. But it kept bread on the table. The church condemned the sin, but tolerated the system. Better, some argued, to have licensed prostitutes than tempt the pure into sin. Preachers railed against fornication in the morning, then turned blind eyes by dusk. Some saints visited brothels to reform. Others were said to have fallen into them, then repented. The line between salvation and shame was threadbare. She was not only her labor, she had lovers. She sang, she embroidered when the work was slow. She carried herbs in her bodice, not only for pleasure, but for protection. She aged quickly. She rarely married. And when she died, she was buried in separate soil. No headstone, no prayer said aloud, only silence, and the faint echo of a coin dropped in a cup once long ago. The idea is familiar. A belt of iron, a lock, a key kept far away. But the truth, like most things in history, is more complex, more rooted in fear than in fact. The chastity belt, as we picture it, metal, hinged, painful, appears often in later tales. But in actual medieval records, it is nearly invisible. Only a few surviving examples exist, and many of those were likely jokes, crafted for noble curiosity, not true imprisonment. The idea that knights locked their wives before riding to the Crusades. A story, repeated in jest, in poetry, later turned into fact by Victorian imagination. But while the belt itself was largely myth, the impulse behind it was real. Girls were married off young, often at 12 or 13. Their purity was tied to family honor, their bodies property of fathers, then husbands. Virginity had value, especially among nobles. Dowries depended on it. So did legitimacy. To ensure this, women were watched, kept from men, kept from books, kept from understanding. Midwives were tasked with confirming virginity. Though they could not truly know, rumors alone could ruin a name. Legends abounded. It was said that virgins would bleed upon first coupling, that a woman who had known a man walked differently, that herbs could tighten or restore one's maidenhood if needed. Washes were made of vinegar, alum, myrrh. Some women wore amulets. Others simply lied and hoped no one could tell. In cases of scandal, violence was common. Honor killings, forced cloistering, a life reduced to silence. But chastity was not just physical, it was behavioral. A woman who spoke too freely, laughed too loudly, or walked unaccompanied was suspect. She might never be touched, yet still be condemned. To ensure this, women were watched, kept from men, kept from books, kept from understanding. Midwives were tasked with confirming virginity, though they could not truly know. Rumors alone could ruin a name. Legends abounded. It was said that virgins would bleed upon first coupling, that a woman who had known a man walked differently, that herbs could tighten or restore one's maidenhood if needed. Washes were made of vinegar, alum, myrrh. Some women wore amulets. Others simply lied and hoped no one could tell. In cases of scandal, violence was common. Honor killings, forced cloistering, a life reduced to silence. But chastity was not just physical. It was behavioral. A woman who spoke too freely, laughed too loudly, or walked unaccompanied was suspect. She might never be touched, yet still be condemned. In medieval paintings, chastity was symbolized by a unicorn, resting only in the lap of a virgin. An image beautiful and unyielding. The belt may have been a myth, but the control was real, and it followed women from cradle to grave, not made of iron, but of custom, silence, and law. To the outside world, the cloister was pure, walled, ordered, sacred, but inside those walls, life persisted. Monks sweated beneath wool robes. Nuns bled, ached, dreamed, and aged. And though their vows swore them to celibacy, their thoughts did not always obey. Chastity was one of the 3 great monastic vows. alongside poverty and obedience. To break it was not merely to sin, but to betray an identity. And yet, even in the holiest orders, there were lapses. A look held too long in the garden, a shared candlelight between neighboring cells, a hand brushed during vespers. Temptation came not from outside the monastery, but from within. When a monk failed, he confessed to a superior, to a chapter of fellow brothers, to God. He might be denied communion, forced to fast, sent to sleep on stone, or reassigned to lower duties, scrubbing floors, waking at colder hours. Some broke the rule again, others never. Nuns who fell in love with priests, with each other, were confined, sometimes transferred, sometimes simply ignored. There was no true guide for desire, only repentance. Some convents were strict, others far more relaxed. In a few, noble-born nuns wore fine linen, kept cats, and received letters from suitors and sisters. There are records of pregnancies, of secret births, of lovers hidden in gardens, of midwives sent at night through the back gate. Yet there are also stories of deep peace, nuns who lived in lifelong affection with a chosen companion, monks who found calm in service and routine. Not all intimacy was physical. Within the cloister bloomed a kind of affection that had no name outside it. Two monks sharing a bench every morning, two nuns trading verses of scripture, tending each other in illness, resting together in the final hours of life. Desire here was not always scandal. Sometimes it was quiet love, housed inside stone and silence. In the cloister, sex was forbidden, but humanity was not. And though their vows asked them to forget the body remembered. The court was a place of ceremony, of silks, silver, and measured words. But behind those finely carved doors, there lived jealousy, envy, and the slow-burning sting of forbidden desire. And sometimes, those desires became known. In the early 14th century, 3 daughters-in-law of King Philip IV were accused of adultery. The accusation came not from clergy or court, but from the king's own daughter, Queen Isabella of England. 2 of the women, Marguerite and Blanche of Burgundy, were imprisoned. Marguerite died in her cell. Her husband, Louis X, had their marriage annulled. Her child, once a princess, was declared illegitimate. The third, Jane, was acquitted, but never trusted again. All it had taken was a servant's word, a misplaced gift, and a rumor shared over wine. Noble women accused of sexual scandal were often stripped of titles, confined to nunneries, or forced into distant estates, their names erased from song and charter. Some faced public trials, others disappeared without trace. In England, Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, was charged with sorcery and adultery in 1441. She was paraded through London barefoot, then imprisoned for life in Peel Castle. There was no sword, no blood, only slow forgetting. But scandal was not reserved for kings. In villages, a woman who conceived out of wedlock might be made to sit at the edge of church, veiled. In some towns, she stood on a public platform, holding her child, while neighbors watched. Men were punished less, often not at all. And yet, for both, shame lingered, not only in gossip, but in legal records, kept in brittle parchment, naming who had erred and when. Scandal fed art. Tales of cheating queens and wandering monks filled the pages of bawdy ballads, sung in taverns and marketplaces. Carvings in cloisters, once sacred, began to reflect crude humor. Stone faces peering from archways, frozen in knowing smirks. History does not always preserve fact, but it remembers spectacle. And so, even centuries later, we whisper the names of those who once hid in candlelight. The medieval body was not always covered in shame. Sometimes it was just tired, cold, in need of warmth and softness. And so there were rituals, slow, simple things that allowed people to care for themselves and for one another. In cities, public bathhouses existed, places where men and women bathed, sometimes separately, sometimes not. Water was warmed in large copper cauldrons, then poured into wooden tubs. Steam rose through the rafters, scented with rosemary, sage, or thyme. Attendants carried towels but were dragged into day. Musicians played softly in the corner. Soap made from ash and lard was rubbed into skin with cloth or rush. And though the church warned of impropriety, people still came for cleanliness, for companionship, for an hour of ease. In homes, beds were shared by more than lovers. Children slept beside parents, servants near masters, travelers with strangers at inns. The body was rarely alone. There was always someone's warmth at one's back, always someone's breath in the room. And within that closeness, quiet affection bloomed. A hand held in sleep, a murmur of comfort during a nightmare, a forehead kissed before dawn. Sex, when not tangled in fear or scandal, could be simple. A husband and wife after supper, a young couple on a feast night, two companions, long devoted, who found comfort in one another after years of hardship. It was not always sacred, not always thrilling, but it was human. And for many, it was the only softness in a hard world. When life ended, the body was bathed again, laid in linen, anointed with herbs, sometimes by lovers, sometimes by children. And in that final washing, there was no shame, only care, only remembrance. In this segment, we drift slowly through the lives of real historical figures, kings, queens, mistresses, and clerics, whose choices around sex, scandal, and succession shaped kingdoms, altered laws, and stirred quiet echoes that lasted for centuries. These aren't biographies in the traditional sense. They're candlelit observations of lives lived under scrutiny and of what remained after the rumors faded. She was born into power, crowned twice, and called everything a woman of her time was not supposed to be. Too clever, too willful, too desiring. Eleanor of Aquitaine was not simply a queen. She was a force, married young, crowned at 15, divorced in her 30s, and imprisoned in her 40s. And through it all, she never surrendered her voice. Eleanor first wed Louis VII of France. He was devout, cautious, and fragile. She was bold, sensual, and politically shrewd. The marriage, strained by personality and geography, produced 2 daughters, but no sons. The Pope refused a divorce, so Louis sought an annulment on grounds of consanguinity, a legal term for shared blood, conveniently ignored when the match was first made. Her second husband was Henry Plantagenet, the soon-to-be King Henry II of England. Their union was passionate, volatile, and politically explosive. She bore him 8 children, including Richard the Lionheart and King John. But Eleanor's influence, in court, in bed, in rebellion, unnerved him. When she supported her sons in a revolt against Henry, he had her imprisoned for 16 years. Yet even in confinement, she endured, wrote letters, advised sons, planned inheritances. Whispers surrounded her all her life, that she rode bare-breasted during the Second Crusade, that she seduced her uncle, that she ruled through the bed as much as the pen. Most of it likely untrue, but the stories persisted, and in those stories we see something rare, a medieval woman whose desires, political and personal, were never fully erased. She died in peace, veiled, surrounded by her lineage, a mother of kings, a woman of scandal, and a figure who outlasted every rumor. He stood over 6 feet tall, charming, handsome, decisive. Edward IV was England's warrior king, the first Yorkist ruler to claim the throne in the Wars of the Roses. But for all his victories in armor, his most lasting alliances were forged in the quiet of his bedchamber. The most famous of his lovers became his wife. Elizabeth Woodville was a Lancastrian widow, beautiful, educated, and politically inconvenient. Edward married her in secret in 1464. When the union was revealed, it shocked the nobility. She was not of royal blood. Her family was large, ambitious, and rapidly elevated through marriage. Critics called her manipulative. They whispered of seduction, of witchcraft, of a spell placed on the king. But Elizabeth reigned beside Edward for nearly 2 decades, bore him 10 children, and proved a formidable political figure in her own right. But Elizabeth was not the only woman to hold Edward's favor. In the final years of his reign, Edward turned to Jane Shore, the wife of a goldsmith, known for her beauty and gentleness. Was not just a lover. She was intelligent, kind, and unusually influential for a commoner. She acted as an intercessor, petitioned for pardons, and was beloved by the people. After Edward's death, she was accused of conspiracy, forced to do public penance, barefoot in the streets of London, not for crime, but for association. Still, she survived. She lived quietly into old age, never denying her past. Edward's lovers were not mere distractions. Each brought with her family, ambition, and risk. Each shifted the balance of court. Each shaped the lives of children, born and unborn, legitimate and not. Even decades later, their names echoed through political claims. When Edward's sons disappeared, the infamous princes in the Tower, their mother's marriage was questioned, their legitimacy attacked, and thus, a moment of intimacy led to a dynastic crisis. Edward IV died suddenly in 1483. He was just 40. His mistresses faded into quiet memory. He wore white robes. He bore the title Holy Father, and yet he fathered many children. Rodrigo Borgia, later crowned Pope Alexander VI, was a man who brought Renaissance grandeur to the Vatican and left a trail of controversy that has never fully vanished. He was not the first pope to break the vow of celibacy, but he was the most visible. Born in Spain, Rodrigo Borgia rose swiftly through church ranks, thanks to family influence and administrative brilliance. By the time he reached the papacy in 1492, he had already fathered several children with his most well-known mistress, Venoza de Catanei. Among those children were Cesare Borgia, brilliant, ruthless, and destined for military command; Lucrezia Borgia, beautiful, intelligent, and married into power again and again. Rodrigo did not hide them. He embraced them. He gave them land, titles, and alliances, and in doing so, shattered. Under Alexander VI, the Vatican flourished and trembled. There were lavish banquets held in papal halls, whispers of dancers, gold-draped mistresses, and masked lovers entering through garden doors. He appointed family to cardinalships, arranged marriages for political convenience, and blurred the line between divine office and dynastic ambition. Critics called him a blasphemer. Others called him practical, a Renaissance prince in a holy robe. No tale of the Borgias is complete without Lucrezia. She was married 3 times, used to solidify alliances. Some said she was a poisoner, others a saintly woman trapped in the games of men. One of her marriages was annulled on grounds of non-consummation, though her husband claimed otherwise. Gossip suggested affairs with her brother, her father, all likely fabricated to damage the family's name. She ended her life quietly, a duchess, a mother, a patron of the arts. Pope Alexander VI died in 1503, likely from illness, though poison was whispered, as it always was with the Borgias. He left behind a church fractured by mistrust, a family legacy both admired and cursed, and a world where the line between sacred and sensual had been permanently blurred. His was not a life of purity, but it was undeniably human. And in the end, that is what remains. Here we move slowly, gently, through time-worn parchment, unearthed bones, forgotten rites, and odd customs of the body. Things never spoken aloud in court or church, yet preserved quietly in clay, lead, and linen. We begin with a mystery unearthed from the damp, grave-dark soil of forgotten convents and countryside graves. Across Europe, in gardens, cellars, behind convent walls and beneath churches, archaeologists have discovered something silent. Tiny graves, often unmarked. Infants, fetuses, buried outside consecrated ground. Too small for a name, too early for baptism. In some cases, midwives had buried them. In others, perhaps the mother herself. They were not supposed to be there. The church decreed that babies who died before baptism could not enter sacred soil. They were believed to exist in limbo, a place outside heaven, where souls rested in silence, untouched by divine light. And so, these infants were buried quietly, in gardens, near thresholds, beneath floorboards, some wrapped in cloth, others curled in ceramic jars. They were not always victims of crime. Often, they were victims of timing, of premature birth, of miscarriage, of poverty, of secrecy. It is believed that midwives, often the only attendants at these deaths, took on the burden of burial. They kept no records. They performed no rites. Only a gesture, covering the body in herbs, placing it in earth with whispered prayers never approved by the church. This practice was not spoken of, but it persisted across centuries. In Sweden, in France, in England, all buried the smallest ones, alone. Archaeological remains revealed trauma, illness, and malformation. Others show no cause of death, just fragile skeletons, undisturbed for 600 years. Some were buried with tokens, a spoon, a flower, a pressed linen doll. One infant was found, cradled in a woman's arms, in a grave marked for no one. DNA evidence now shows these were often illegitimate births or stillbirths hidden from the parish. The church saw them as souls denied. But the bones tell a quieter story, of grief, of helplessness, and the wish to protect, even after death. For centuries, convents were seen as places of purity, stone-walled, candlelit, and cloistered from the world. But in crypts beneath ruined abbeys, in forgotten cemeteries behind monastic grounds, archaeologists have uncovered a quiet anomaly. Nuns who died pregnant in several medieval convent cemeteries across Europe, particularly in Germany, northern Italy, and parts of Britain. Skeletal remains have been studied that clearly show signs of late-stage pregnancy. Pelvic bones widened from childbirth. Fetal remains found within abdominal cavities, sometimes two bodies buried together, a woman and her unborn child. Without inscription, there were no church records of these deaths. No names, only dates and ages carved on moss-worn stone. Not all were the result of abuse or crime. Some pregnancies may have been the product of consensual relationships with priests, monks, or even male workers on the convent grounds. Some nuns entered the cloister as widows, others as young girls, promised by families unable to provide a dowry, and some may have simply known love. The church did not want to know. Their bodies were hidden quietly or reburied outside consecrated walls. The rules were clear, but life, as always, was not. A pregnant nun faced public disgrace, excommunication, and lifelong confinement in a penitential house. But many were not punished. Instead, they vanished from the record. Convent communities, small and tightly knit, may have protected their own. Some abbesses, especially those of noble rank, had both the means and the will to keep such secrets buried. Most were young, under 30, some no older than 16. They bore no signs of trauma, no injury, only the quiet arc of the womb preserved in bone. Their stories were erased in ink, but etched gently in calcium and silence. Today, they are not studied to shame, but to understand how the human body resisted even sacred rules, and how behind each rule stood a woman, alone. In the world of the Middle Ages, medicine was uncertain. The church offered prayer. Physicians offered bloodletting. But for the poor, and often for women, healing came not through theory, but through touch, symbol, and faith in things unseen. And so they carried amulets. Amulets came in many forms: dried herbs wrapped in cloth, carved bone pendants, tiny scrolls with protective psalms, clay figures shaped like wombs, infants, or some were worn around the waist to prevent miscarriage. Others were hidden beneath pillows to encourage conception. Some were swallowed, ground into powder. In desperate hope, midwives often kept bundles of such objects: a tooth of a wolf, a belt woven on St. Margaret's feast day, a strip of linen marked with holy words, a tiny wax figure used in prayers for safe labor. These items passed from one woman to another, never catalogued, never named in law, only remembered in quiet voices and kitchen smoke. The church condemned such objects as superstition. Yet even priests were known to carry charms. Some amulets bore the names of saints. Others were more pagan, invoking the moon, ancient goddesses, or unknowable powers from before Christian time. Women who were caught using them, especially during childbirth, might be accused of witchcraft, but most simply hid them deeper. In graves of young women and infants, amulets are sometimes found tucked near the pelvis or resting beneath the neck. Red coral beads, believed to ward off evil, tiny bells, seed pods, copper crosses blackened with age. One woman, buried in southern France, was found with a tiny lead charm shaped like a closed eye. It had been pierced, tied with wool, and worn for years. No one knows why. These objects were not meant for display. They were deeply personal, carried in secret, touched during prayer, pressed between hands in moments of fear. Whether they worked did not matter. They comforted. The body in the medieval mind was made of four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health depended on their balance. Emotion, fertility, even morality were linked to these unseen fluids. And from this belief, an entire world of ritual, remedy, and restriction emerged. The presence or absence of blood during first intercourse became a symbol of virginity. But biology was misunderstood. Women who did not bleed were often shamed or suspected of hidden sin. Some were examined by midwives. Others simply cast aside. To appear untouched, some used vinegar, alum, or even sharp herbs before marriage, hoping to induce bleeding where nature did not. Some, in fear, cut themselves privately to stain sheets in secret. There were no tests, only expectations. Medieval physicians believed both men and women produced seed. Conception required both, but only male seed was thought to shape form and spirit. Women's bodies were seen as passive containers. Wombs were called cold and required warming through diet, heat, or intercourse to receive life. A woman who conceived without passion, believed to bear weak or deformed children. Desire was not a sin, but a necessity for healthy birth. To increase fertility, women were advised to sleep with garlic beneath their pillows, drink wine steeped with ash bark, bathe in milk infused with sage or lovage. To prevent conception, others turned to rue, pennyroyal, and tansy, bitter herbs that induced bleeding, amulets soaked in menstrual blood, prayers to saints known for silence and solitude. Some midwives administered pessaries made of wool soaked in vinegar or honey. Some used spells carved into beeswax, inserted and then burned. No method was certain, but hope endured. If a woman wept too much, or laughed without reason, or felt faint and forgetful, it was said her womb had wandered, detached, floating through the body, searching for fulfillment. To coax it back into place, physicians lit scented resins near the thighs, or applied cold compresses to the chest. This was not cruelty. It was the only knowledge they had, and within it, a strange kind of care. Most remedies didn't work. Many caused harm, but behind each tincture salve, and charm was the same longing, to conceive or not, to be safe, to feel in control of a body that history rarely let women name as their own. The first son secured the dynasty. The second, protection. Daughters were useful, to be married off, but never crowned. When a queen failed to produce sons, whispers spread faster than fire. Was she cursed? Too cold? Punished by God? Some kings took mistresses openly. Others sought annulment. A few turned to monasteries in despair. A queen's body was never her own. Every swelling, every illness, every silence was examined by midwives, scribes, and stewards. Some royal births were witnessed by dozens of courtiers to ensure no false child was swapped in. There are records of women giving birth, surrounded by noblewomen, with bishops waiting at the door. Stillbirths were mourned, but also politicized. A belly that swelled, but never bore a son, became a nation's quiet grief. Queens who failed to conceive or whose sons died young were often banished, spiritually or physically. Isabella of Valois was sent to a convent. Anne of Bohemia was labeled barren and cold. Catherine of Aragon's childless years became reason for annulment. Their husbands were kings, but their own bodies stood trial. In the medieval world of power and crown, marriage was not personal. It was political. Every union had a purpose: to forge an alliance, to secure land, to claim legitimacy. And so brides were chosen not for beauty or charm, but for blood. It was common for royal children to be betrothed as infants. A girl of 7 might be promised to a boy of 9, with a dowry that included entire provinces. Some were married as early as 12 or 13. Their bodies were not yet ready for motherhood, but readiness was not required. Treaties demanded compulsion. When a noble woman left her homeland to marry a foreign prince, she rarely returned. She crossed borders with a retinue, a chest of linens, and a new name. Her language, her customs, even her food, unfamiliar. She was expected to adapt, conceive, and embody the virtues of both realms. Her success was measured not in happiness, but in offspring. Some couples met on their wedding day. They exchanged vows in Latin, touched lips, and were led to a bedding chamber where witnesses watched them lie down, not out of prurience, but to ensure legitimacy. In many courts, bedding ceremonies were public, ritualized affairs. What followed was not always consummated that night. But it did not matter. The symbol was what mattered. Many of these marriages grew into mutual respect, some into quiet companionship, but others decayed into coldness or even cruelty. Yet noble women rarely divorced. To leave a husband was to lose land, children, and status. Instead, they remained, writing letters, praying in chapels, or pouring their affections into their households and gardens. Their sorrow was recorded only in poems or in the silences of court annals. In every medieval court, there were mistresses. Some were fleeting, others endured for decades. And though they held no title, their presence often shaped decisions more than queens themselves. They were not wives, but in many cases, they were loved. Kings were expected to have mistresses. It was seen as natural, even inevitable. Some were commoners, some were widows, some were young noble women whose beauty caught the eye of power. They were given rooms in the palace, gowns, horses, even estates. Children born to them, called bastards, were often raised with privilege, sometimes even knighted. Some mistresses became advisors in all but name. They passed notes, hosted ambassadors, softened tempers. A well-placed mistress could end a war or begin one. Agnes Sorel, beloved of Charles VII of France, was painted as the Virgin Mary, crowned with jewels and given a seat near the king at court. Catherine Swynford, mistress to John of Gaunt, was eventually married by him, her descendants becoming the House of Tudor. In Italy and Iberia, courtesans emerged as an elite class of mistresses, women trained not just in seduction, but in poetry, music, and politics. They were literate, articulate, often more educated than queens. Men sought them not only for pleasure, but for conversation and confidence. They moved between salons, palaces, and libraries, less guarded by guards than by wit. But not all mistresses lived in comfort. Some fell from favor quickly. Others were discarded quietly or forced into convents to erase the past. Their security was bound to affection, and affection in court was never guaranteed. They bore children who could not inherit. They watched their names fade from ledgers, even if they had once shared the king's breath in sleep. For many, it was better than marriage. There was no crown, but also no obligation to bear an heir. They had influence, space, even admiration, as long as they remained useful and did not dream too loudly of permanence. In castles and keeps, among embroidered tapestries and echoing corridors, noble children grew up not in freedom, but in anticipation. Their bodies were watched before they even matured, their futures arranged before they could spell their names. They were not raised to live, but to fulfill a role. For noble girls, virginity was non-negotiable. It was not simply virtue, it was proof of value. A noble woman who arrived at marriage without virginity might be cast aside, her dowry refused, her father shamed, and so her body was guarded. Many were sent to nunneries, not for spiritual life, but as places to preserve their innocence until marriageable age. For noble sons not in line to inherit, there were two fates: the church or marriage by arrangement. Boys as young as 10 were given tonsure, their hair shaved in the sign of religious commitment, sometimes before they even understood its meaning. Some would rise to become abbots or bishops. Others lived quietly, devout, repressed, and forgotten. Their vows were made for them, and few were ever reversed. When a noble daughter reached puberty, her body became the center of negotiation. Midwives confirmed her development. Maids embroidered her trousseau. Letters were sent across kingdoms. Her virginity was ensured with oaths, sealed with alliances, and dressed in white linen. She was taught little about the act itself, only that it must occur and must result in heirs. If she was barren or too long untouched, blame would fall swiftly on her shoulders. Most accepted their roles. Some resisted quietly. A few escaped by eloping, refusing the veil, or simply vanishing into pilgrimage. But most lived within walls, sleeping beneath saints' icons, holding rosaries, and praying for strength. Strength to be what they had to be. To us, it may feel cruel, but in their world, this was duty. Virginity was pride. Silence was protection. Sacrifice was not questioned, it was expected. And for those noble sons and daughters, raised in cold corridors and under watchful eyes, Their repression was not failure, it was identity. And so, we bring this journey to its quiet end. The stories of flesh, secrecy, duty, and silence, left behind in candlelit halls, cloistered gardens, and worn tapestries of a world long gone. Thank you for letting this story unfold gently around you tonight, for giving these forgotten lives your time and your calm, whether you listened for rest, for curiosity, or simply to let your mind drift through the cold stone corridors of the past. Your presence here matters. So now, if your eyes are still open, we invite you to let your body soften. Unclench the jaw. Release the shoulders. Let the room grow quieter still. If you haven't already, go ahead and silence your phone. Set your screen aside. And if you're using headphones, let them settle lightly. Not too tight. Just enough to hold the voice near. If you'd like to, leave a gentle comment below. What time are you listening to this? Is it midnight? 4 in the morning? Or just a quiet afternoon you needed for yourself? We're building a small, sleepy archive of those moments. An unseen community of night listeners and dreamers of history. This video was part of our series, Boring History for Sleep, where slowness is a gift and the past is a place to rest in. Until next time, may your dreams be free of cold castles, and your heart warm with quiet stories that never made it into textbooks. Sleep well. And thank you, truly, for being here.